In my experience, most young earth creationists are also biblical inerrantists. They insist that the Bible contains no errors, and that a plain reading of the text is what leads them to the conclusion that God created the universe in 6 literal 24-hour days some 6,000 years ago. Now, if they applied such interpretation consistently, and if the Bible really did contain no errors, then it should be easy for them to answer the following question: how many sons did Abraham have? But, as I will show you, the answer is anything but straightforward. These young earth biblical literalists tend to favor the King James Version, so that is what I will be referring to here. Now, please open your Bibles and turn to Genesis chapter 16, verses 15 to 16.
And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram.
For context, this is before Abraham's name was changed from Abram to Abraham. Chapter 16 of Genesis describes how Abram's wife Sarai, later to be renamed Sarah, was unable to conceive, so she invited her husband to have sex with her Egyptian servant Hagar, and of course he obliged, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son called Ishmael. According to this chapter, Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Then, some 14 years later, according to Genesis chapter 21 verses 2 to 3,
For Sarah conceived, and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bare to him, Isaac.
At this point in the story, Sarah was in her 90s and Abraham was 100 years old. Compare that to what we now know about human fertility and the menopause. Now, please turn to the book of Galatians in the New Testament, chapter 4, verse 22. Paul says,
For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman.
So here we have New Testament confirmation of something from the Old Testament. So far so good. Now it gets more confusing. Please turn back to Genesis chapter 22 this time, verse 2, where God is talking to Abraham.
And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of.
Did you see that? His only son. Ishmael seems to have been forgotten. Now, for New Testament confirmation of this, please turn to chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews, the one which describes faith, and look at verse 17.
By faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son.
So, we have Old and New Testament verses which separately describe Abraham as having 2 sons and 1 son. How can that be in an inerrant book? But there's even more confusion. Please now turn to Genesis chapter 25, from the top.
Then again Abraham took a wife, and her name was Keturah. And she bare him Zimran, and Jokshan, and Medan, and Midian, and Ishbak, and Shua.
So from this, we learn that Abraham had a further 6 sons before dying at the age of 145. This is confirmed in the first book of Chronicles, chapter 1, verse 32. But unlike in the book of Genesis, it describes Keturah as Abraham's concubine, not his wife, and the 6 boys were her sons, despite Abraham being the father. So here's the question again. How many sons did Abraham have? Was it 1, 2, or 8? The answer depends on which verses you read and how you try to harmonize them. A typical apologetic answer is that each of the descriptions makes sense in its own context. But I would ask, how can Isaac be his only son if Ishmael was his older half-brother, a young teenager, at the time Isaac was born? For 14 years, Ishmael would have been Abraham's only son, but after that, and at the time of Isaac's binding and near sacrifice, he would have been the youngest of 2. As for Paul's writings, in the 1st century, Surely he must have known that Abraham had more than 2 sons. But apparently not. And then there is the author of Hebrews, also written many centuries after Genesis, who regarded Isaac as Abraham's only son. What is going on here? I submit that far from being an inerrant book, the Bible is a collection of the writings of numerous authors who had greater or lesser knowledge of ancient folklore, and then at the time of the compilation of what we now refer to as the Bible, the copyists faithfully recorded the stories as they were written, and it is only in more recent times that apologists and biblical literalists have attempted to harmonize these obviously conflicting stories. While I acknowledge that the authors were almost certainly inspired by their concept of God, the idea that a God guided the pens, or quills, of all the authors in order to ensure that no inconsistencies crept in simply doesn't hold water. So, if you claim that the Bible is inerrant, how come you can harmonize these inconsistencies, yet you cannot harmonize Genesis 1 with modern science? Modern Christian organizations such as the BioLogos Foundation, most Anglicans, countless millions of other Protestants, and the Catholic Church can. So why can't you?